few moments, Steve Sweedler will brilliantly chant Torah. The exact words that are in the Torah. No fudging and no, there'll be no creativity. And these are the words, the translation of what he'll read. The Eternal said to me, "Carve out 2 tablets of stone like the first, and come up to me on the mountain and make an ark of wood. And I will inscribe on the tablets the commandments that were on the first tablets that you smashed, and you shall deposit them in the ark." And so Moses made an ark. He speaks in the first person here. I made an ark of acacia wood, because Moses is talking to the people. And carved out 2 tablets of stone like the first. I took the 2 tablets with me and went up the mountain. It's very typical of Deuteronomy. It's Moses' retelling of what's happened. So the obvious question is, why? Why say it again? There's a fancy word. Well, first let me go back and say there's a great theological debate you can have with Rabbi Horowitz that he and I got to have over lunch today, which is, how do we translate the word God? It's funny because I'm thinking of it because here on the paper, as he'll appreciate, or not appreciate actually, they won't put God's name in English on the paper here because the website I printed it from won't do that. So what do? Is they put it in the Hebrew, which is like, you can talk to him about that. He'll give you a whole essay on what we should do with God's name when we put it on a piece of paper. So we have this section in Deuteronomy where Deuteronomy's telling us, hey, remember, we made the tablets again. Remember, you experienced the breaking of the tablets, but don't forget, you also experienced the remaking of the tablets. So here's another fancy theological word, which I don't even know how to pronounce, so I'm going to guess. It's antinomy. Either it depends on how you put maybe literature people know. I don't know. I played with it. It could be pronounced different ways. I'm going to call it antinomy. What it means is that there's this and that. There's one thing that's perhaps we would say black and one thing that's white. There's one thing that's bad and there's one thing that's good. The classic text for this, you know well, is Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, chapter 3. There's a time for being born. There's a time for dying. There's a time for planting, a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and there's a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for ripping and a time for sowing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. We hear those words all the time, and we say, okay, so life is filled with lots of times. That's fine. But why do we need to hear this and that? Why do we need to know that the tablets were broken and they were fixed? Why do we need to know that there's a time for throwing stones and there's a time for gathering stones? Rabbi Steve Leader, who I was lucky to have as a teacher when I was in the seminary, he has written a number of books. One of his more recent books, More Beautiful Than Before, is his reflections on mourning and after the loss of his father. And he writes about an experience he had as a rabbi where a man died too young. I believe he says he passed away when he was 40. And it was somebody he had been close to. And he was leaving the funeral, and he says, I turned off the radio, I'm driving on the highway, and I just wanted to take a moment because all I could think about is life is too short. And so I shouldn't waste time listening to stuff on the radio. I shouldn't waste anything because this man's life was so short. A few weeks later, he was officiating at the bat mitzvah of that man's daughter. He's back in the car after the bat mitzvah, and he says, I turned the radio off again, and I realized perhaps life is also long. Long enough. Long enough for this family to recover. Long enough for this daughter to be able to have joy again at her bat mitzvah. Not that it was perfect, but life is not only short, life is also long. Life also gives us the chance to get back from the losses sometimes. Here's how he writes in reflecting on these moments. I'm caught between two realities, both easy to prove, yet diametrically opposed. Life is short and life is long. Time really does fly at a bewildering speed, and yet life, for most people, has never been longer in all of human history. Life expectancy in America has doubled in the past 100 years. So which is it? Which truth shall we construct our lives upon? Life is short or life is long? You see, it's all a matter of emphasis, he says. When we are in pain, the right thing to emphasize is clear. In pain, it is so important to remember that although there are tragic examples of life being far too short, for most of us, life is longer than it has ever been in all of human history, and therefore it is long enough to heal from our pain. For most of us, despite the cliche, despite the frantic pace at which we choose to live our lives, life will be long. Remembering that life is long is especially important when we are confronted by the more rare but sad and very painful truth that life is also sometimes far too short. And so in Deuteronomy, Steve will read for us, not that the tablets were broken this week, but that the tablets were fixed. They were created anew because our story is long enough, not only for brokenness, but also for healing. We read in Ecclesiastes, there's a time for terrible things, but most of Ecclesiastes, not all of it, but most of that chapter, has the challenging, destructive part come first, and the healing, loving, hopeful part comes second. That there will be pain, and God willing, there will be time for healing. A time for war, it ends, and a time for peace.